In the merciless grip of winter, a small mountain town lay buried beneath layers of pristine white, its edges blurred by the relentless storm that had raged for 3 days without pause. The wind howled like a wounded animal, clawing at the walls of a solitary cabin nestled among ancient pines that swayed dangerously under the weight of snow and ice. Inside, Daniel sat motionless by the flickering fireplace, his weathered face illuminated by dancing flames that cast long shadows across the wooden walls. A man who had chosen solitude after life had taken everything from him. He stared into the fire as if searching for answers in its amber depths. His only companions, the crackling of burning logs and memories he couldn't escape. Then, cutting through the howling gale, came a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as a trick of the wind. A high-pitched, desperate cry, fragile yet persistent, pierced the frozen air outside his door. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat as he tilted his head, listening. There it was again, unmistakable now, a creature in distress, its voice growing weaker with each plaintive call. For long moments, he remained still, torn between the safety of his warm shelter and the mysterious summons from the storm. Something in that cry resonated with a place deep within him he thought had long since frozen over. With a heavy sigh that clouded before his face, Daniel rose slowly from his chair, joints stiff from years of mountain living. He wrapped himself in layers of weathered wool and fur, pulling on thick gloves as the cry came again, more desperate this time. What creature could survive in such bitter cold? What living thing would venture so close to human dwelling in this blizzard? The question swirled in his mind as he lifted the heavy latch on his door. The wind nearly knocked him backward as he stepped onto his porch, snow immediately dusting his eyelashes and beard. Squinting against the stinging cold, Daniel raised his lantern, its golden light creating a small sphere of visibility in the swirling white darkness. He took a tentative step forward, then another, following that mysterious sound into the heart of the storm, unaware that what awaited him in the blinding snow would forever alter the course of his solitary existence. The blinding curtain of snow parted momentarily as Daniel's lantern cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene that stopped his heartbeat for a painful second. There, half buried in a pristine drift beside his worn wooden steps, lay a creature so fragile it seemed to be dissolving into the storm itself. A cat, once perhaps sleek and proud, now reduced to a trembling shadow of bone and matted fur. The feline's eyes caught the lantern light and reflected back something ancient and primal, a desperation that transcended the barriers between species. Those eyes, wide amber pools against the white backdrop, held Daniel's gaze with an intensity that sent a shiver through him, entirely unrelated to the bitter cold. The cat's sides heaved with shallow, labored breaths, each one creating the smallest cloud of vapor that disappeared instantly into the howling night. Daniel crouched lower, his weathered hand instinctively reaching out before hesitating midway. The cat made no move to flee, too weak perhaps, or somehow knowing this human represented its last chance against the merciless elements. As the lantern light shifted, Daniel noticed something else that made his throat tighten. Just beyond the mother cat, partially concealed by a drift, two impossibly small forms huddled together in a knot of wet fur and fading warmth. Kittens, their eyes still closed to a world that had welcomed them with nothing but cruelty and cold. In that moment, time seemed suspended as Daniel faced the choice before him. These were wild creatures, carriers perhaps of disease or parasites. His cabin was small, his supplies limited. Taking in 3 animals meant responsibility, care, complications he hadn't invited into his carefully constructed solitude. What if the mother was too far gone? What if the kittens couldn't be saved? Wouldn't it be kinder to let nature take its harsh but inevitable course? Yet as he watched, one of the kittens released a cry so faint it was barely perceptible, the sound that had somehow traveled through the raging storm to find him. The mother cat's eyes never left his face, holding neither judgment nor plea, but something far more powerful, a silent recognition between two souls facing the wilderness, one internal, one external. Daniel's hands moved before his mind could finish its deliberation, reaching slowly toward the fragile family balanced on the knife edge between life and extinction. With trembling hands weathered by years of mountain solitude, Daniel unfastened his heavy coat, the wind tearing at the fabric as he pulled it from his shoulders. The mother cat watched his every movement through half-lidded eyes, her body tensed like a spring despite her weakness. Gently, as if handling precious artifacts from a forgotten world, Daniel wrapped the old woolen garment around her frail form, whispering words that disappeared into the howling gale, reassurances perhaps as much for himself as for the creature in his arms. The cat's muscles coiled beneath his touch, a final reserve of wild instinct rippling through her emaciated frame, yet she made no attempt to flee or fight. Something in those amber eyes spoke of understanding beyond language. This human represented her last desperate chance, the final sanctuary between her babies and the merciless white death surrounding them. As Daniel carefully gathered the tiny kittens, their bodies no larger than pine cones and frightfully still, he felt the weight of life itself in his palms. The cabin door groaned against the wind as he shouldered it open, crossing the threshold from the realm of winter's fury into his humble haven of warmth and light. The transition was jarring, the roar of the storm suddenly muffled, replaced by the gentle crackling of the hearth fire that cast its golden glow across rough-hewn floors and simple furnishings. Snowflakes clung to Daniel's beard and eyelashes, melting slowly as the heat of the room embraced them. With reverent care, he placed the bundled family near the fire, creating a nest of his softest blankets atop an old wooden chest. The mother cat's eyes reflected the dancing flames, but the kittens lay frightfully motionless, their tiny bodies showing no visible signs of the precious life they contained. Daniel's heart constricted with a sharp pain he hadn't felt in years, the ache of impending loss, of arriving too late to make a difference. "Please," he whispered, the word hanging in the warm air between them, a prayer to whatever forces might be listening. His calloused fingers hovered uncertainly over the tiny forms, afraid to confirm what seemed increasingly inevitable. The mother cat watched him with an intensity that pierced through the layers of isolation he had wrapped around himself, her trust a fragile bridge extended across a chasm of species and experience. As the storm raged beyond his walls, Daniel realized with startling clarity that in his attempt to save these creatures from death, he had invited something far more dangerous into his carefully guarded sanctuary: hope. Time seemed to crystallize in the amber light of the cabin as Daniel knelt before the tiny, motionless bodies nestled in the blanket nest. The kittens lay silent and still, their delicate limbs stiff as winter branches, their eyes sealed shut against a world they had barely glimpsed, a world that had offered them nothing but ice and wind and darkness. Daniel's weathered hands hovered above them, suddenly unsure. These creatures were so small, so impossibly fragile, balanced on the thinnest edge between existence and oblivion. Something ancient and primal moved through him then, bypassing thought entirely. His rough fingertips, more accustomed to splitting wood and mending traps than nurturing life, began to gently stroke the first kitten. With a tenderness that would have surprised anyone who knew the solitary mountain man, Daniel massaged the frozen form with circular motions, his touch feather-light yet persistent. He moved to the second kitten, performing the same ritual, whispering encouragements that filled the cabin with soft sounds it hadn't known in years. The mother cat watched his every movement through exhausted eyes, her own breathing shallow but steady. Daniel reached for a small pot warming by the fire, pouring steaming milk into a shallow bowl. The rich, sweet aroma rose between them as he placed it near her muzzle. For long moments, she simply stared, as if weighing whether to accept this final surrender to human care. Then, with painful slowness, her rough tongue extended to taste the offering, once, twice, before she began to lap with increasing urgency. "That's it," Daniel murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Fight. You must fight now." As if in response to his command, something happened that caused Daniel's breath to catch in his throat. Beneath his continuing gentle strokes, one of the kittens twitched, a movement so slight it might have been imagined. He paused, staring intently, his own heart seeming to suspend its rhythm. There it was again, a tiny paw flexing, stretching against his fingertip like the unfurling of a fern in spring's first warmth. The second kitten followed, a minuscule shudder running through its diminutive frame. A sound escaped Daniel's lips, half laugh, half sob, startling in the quiet cabin. The mother cat's ears pricked forward at the noise, her amber eyes meeting his with what could only be described as shared understanding. In that silent exchange between man and beast, something profound passed between them. A covenant formed in the crucible of survival, where life's fragile flame refused to be extinguished by winter's cruel breath. Like the first note of a forgotten melody, it drifted through the cabin, so faint that Daniel nearly missed it beneath the crackling of the fire and the distant howling of the relentless storm. A sound barely substantial enough to be called a meow, more a whisper from the threshold of existence itself, yet it filled the small room completely. Daniel froze, his calloused hands suspended in midair as he leaned closer to the blanket nest, hardly daring to breathe lest he drown out this precious evidence of perseverance. There it was again, the smaller of the two kittens, its eyes still firmly sealed against the world, opened its tiny pink mouth and released a sound that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. So small, yet containing within it an unmistakable declaration: I am here. I will fight. I choose life. The mother cat's ears twitched at the sound, her amber eyes widening with a sudden fierce alertness that transformed her gaunt face. With trembling limbs that betrayed her profound exhaustion, she dragged herself from her place by the fire toward her babies. Each movement clearly cost her dearly, yet she continued with single-minded determination, closing the short distance with painful slowness. Daniel made no move to help, instinctively understanding that this journey, however small, was one she needed to make on her own. When she reached the kittens, she began to groom them with gentle, methodical strokes of her rough tongue. The sound of her rasping licks filled the cabin with a rhythm as ancient as life itself, the eternal cadence of mother and child, of care and connection that transcended species and circumstance. As Daniel watched, the second kitten stirred, responding to its mother's touch with a barely perceptible stretch of its miniature limbs. Something unfamiliar and warm expanded in Daniel's chest, pressing against ribs that had guarded an emptiness for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be filled. The sensation was almost painful in its intensity, this unexpected surge of joy mingled with fear, of hope shadowed by the knowledge of how easily it could be extinguished. His eyes met the mother cat's, and in that moment of silent communion, Daniel understood with sudden clarity that they stood only at the beginning of their shared journey. These tiny flames of life had been coaxed back from the brink, but the real challenge lay ahead. Days of uncertainty, of careful nurturing, of navigating a path forward that neither he nor this wild creature had chosen, yet now faced together in the heart of winter's domain. As midnight descended and the blizzard reached its furious crescendo, the cabin stood defiant against nature's assault, a tiny island of warmth in an ocean of swirling white. Daniel had not left his vigil by the fire, adding logs with methodical care each time the flames threatened to diminish. The hours stretched like shadows across the wooden floor, marked only by the occasional shifting of coals and the increasingly confident breaths of the three small creatures who had so unexpectedly entered his life. His own exhaustion hung heavy on his shoulders, yet sleep remained a distant thought. Instead, his eyes traced the subtle movements of the feline family, the almost imperceptible rise and fall of tiny rib cages, the occasional twitch of a miniature paw dreaming of warmth. The mother cat drifted between alertness and exhaustion, her amber eyes opening periodically to check her surroundings before surrendering again to her body's desperate need for healing rest. Sometime past midnight, Daniel rose with creaking knees and moved toward the far corner of the cabin, where wooden crates and canvas-covered shapes held the artifacts of a life he had packed away long ago. His hands moved with certainty in the dim light, pushing aside layers of dust and memory until they found what they sought: a small circular bed with faded blue fabric, edges worn soft by years of use and affection. He lifted it reverently, fingers tracing the familiar texture as long-suppressed images flooded back. A companion who had shared his life before solitude became his chosen path. Without allowing himself to linger in the past, Daniel brought the bed to the fireside, placing it carefully near enough to benefit from the hearth's warmth without risking overheating his fragile guests. The mother cat watched his approach with half-lidded eyes, neither trusting nor rejecting as he gently transferred her family to this new sanctuary. Once settled, the kittens instinctively crawled closer to their mother's depleted body, seeking the primal comfort of her presence. She curled around them with protective tenderness, forming a living fortress of bone and fur and fierce maternal love. In the hushed sanctuary of that moment, with the storm raging beyond his walls and these three hearts beating a fragile rhythm beside his hearth, Daniel was struck by a realization that pierced through layers of carefully constructed isolation. The emptiness of his cabin had never been a peaceful solitude, but rather an echo chamber for his grief. A void he had mistaken for healing when it was merely absence. As he watched the small family huddled together, their very existence a triumph against impossible odds, he recognized in their instinctive closeness a reflection of what he himself had been missing all along. Dawn followed dawn as the blizzard finally released its icy grip on the mountain, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white sculpted into fantastic shapes by the wind's artistic hand. Inside the cabin, another transformation unfolded, one equally miraculous but infinitely more delicate. Under Daniel's watchful care, the mother cat's hollow flanks began to fill, her dull coat slowly regaining hints of its former luster with each small meal he coaxed her to accept. His days now followed a rhythm dictated by these unexpected companions, warming milk, preparing small portions of the precious meat he had stored for winter, fashioning a makeshift litter box from an old wooden crate. His calloused hands, once most comfortable wielding an axe or skinning knife, now performed tasks of surprising gentleness, mixing kitten formula from supplies discovered in his forgotten stores, feeding the tiny creatures with a dropper when their mother's milk proved insufficient. On the fifth morning, as weak winter sunlight filtered through frost-covered windows, Daniel witnessed a sight that stopped his breath. One kitten, the larger of the two, struggling to push itself up on wobbly legs, its tiny paws spreading wide for balance on the soft bed. Not to be outdone, its sibling followed, managing 3 uncertain steps before tumbling onto its side with a squeak of surprise that filled the cabin with unexpected lightness. But it was the following day that brought the moment Daniel found himself inexplicably waiting for, the first kitten's eyes, unsealing to reveal brilliant blue orbs that blinked uncertainly at the world. By sunset, both had opened their eyes, taking in their surroundings with that unique blend of caution and boundless curiosity that only felines possess. And as they explored their limited world with increasing confidence, Daniel noticed the mother cat's behavior changing, her amber gaze following him across the room, not with wariness, but with something approaching recognition. When he approached their bed, she no longer tensed. When his hand extended toward her kittens, she watched with alert attention, but no fear. A bridge of trust was forming between them, built of small moments, her acceptance of food from his fingers, her willingness to let him stroke her head while she nursed her young, her slow blinks of acknowledgement when he spoke to her in the quiet evenings. Yet as Daniel watched the small family thriving under his care, a troubling thought began to take root in his mind. These were not domesticated animals born to human companionship. They were wild creatures, temporarily dependent, but ultimately belonging to a world beyond his cabin walls. The mother's strengthening body and increasingly alert demeanor reminded him that her dependence was finite, her presence in his life potentially fleeting. What right did he have to keep what was never truly his? And yet, how could he bear to release them back to the merciless wilderness that had nearly claimed their lives? As January yielded to February, the world outside the cabin began its imperceptible shift towards spring. Though winter's grip remained firm on the mountain, inside, the transformation was far more dramatic. The kittens now tumbled and played across the wooden floor, their bodies plump with health, their eyes bright with mischief and wonder. The mother cat had regained her strength, her once skeletal frame now sleek and powerful, her movements fluid with returning vitality. It was on a crystal-clear morning, as Daniel stoked the fire to chase away the dawn chill, that he noticed her sitting motionless by the door. Her posture was alert, ears forward, tail twitching with subtle intensity as she stared at the wooden barrier, as if seeing through it to the world beyond. Something in her demeanor sent a pang through his chest, recognition of a restlessness he knew all too well, the call of something essential that could not be denied. She returned to that spot each day, sometimes for hours, her amber eyes fixed on the door with unwavering focus, while her kittens romped nearby, blissfully unaware of their mother's growing preoccupation. Daniel watched this ritual with growing unease, understanding the message in her behavior with painful clarity. She needed to leave. The wild that had nearly claimed her life now beckoned her return. His nights grew restless, filled with weighing impossible choices. The nearest animal shelter was in the town below, a place he avoided with almost religious dedication. Even if he made the journey, what awaited them there? Cold metal cages, separation, uncertain futures at the hands of strangers. His mind conjured images of the kittens confused and frightened, the mother cat's trust in him shattered by what would feel like final betrayal. Yet keeping them here presented its own impossibilities. The mother's increasing restlessness told its own story. She was a creature of forest and field, not hearth and home. To deny her that return would be to cage her as surely as any shelter. But could the kittens, born to the wild but nurtured in human warmth, survive what nearly killed them once before? One evening, as Daniel sat contemplating these questions, the mother cat abandoned her post by the door and approached him with deliberate steps. She sat before him, her gaze level with his own, and in that moment of profound communion between species, Daniel felt she was asking something of him, not freedom for herself alone, but something more complex, a solution he had yet to discover. The choice before him seemed impossible: honor her need for freedom or protect her children from the dangers that freedom entailed. As snow began to fall once more beyond his windows, Daniel understood he had reached the crossroads where humanity's compassion and nature's wisdom met in uneasy balance. Morning arrived with breathtaking clarity, the storm having swept itself into distant memory during the night. When Daniel pulled back the faded curtain from his window, he was greeted by a world transformed. A flawless expanse of pristine white stretching toward the distant town, each tree and fence post adorned with crystalline crowns that sparkled in the newborn sunlight. The perfect stillness after nature's fury felt almost sacred, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. With methodical movements that belied his inner turmoil, Daniel gathered supplies for the journey he had finally resolved to make. An old wooden crate lined with his softest blankets formed a temporary haven for the feline family. His fingers worked with careful precision, creating a nest that would shield them from the biting cold during the long trek to town. Each fold of fabric felt like a silent goodbye, each preparation a step toward the inevitable parting. The kittens watched his work with curious eyes, occasionally pouncing on a dangling blanket edge with playful innocence, unaware of the significance of his actions. The mother cat, however, observed from a distance, her amber gaze following his every movement with an intensity that seemed to penetrate his very thoughts. When everything was finally prepared, Daniel donned his heaviest coat and boots, then gently placed the kittens into their traveling home. They mewed in protest at the confinement, their tiny voices piercing his resolve with each plaintive sound. Last, he turned to the mother cat, extending his hands to complete the family's gathering. She did not run or resist. Instead, she approached the door with purposeful steps and sat before it, her tail wrapped neatly around her paws. Daniel reached for the latch, his heart heavy with finality. The door swung open, revealing the brilliant white expanse beyond, a canvas of possibility and peril. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine and promise. The mother cat did not bolt toward freedom as he had expected. Instead, she turned her face upward to meet his gaze, then looked deliberately at her kittens in their box and back to Daniel. The message in those amber eyes was unmistakable, not a desire for escape, but a silent negotiation, a plea that transcended the barriers of species. In that crystalline moment, something shifted within Daniel's chest, a realization as sudden and complete as the clearing of the storm. The choice he had been agonizing over had already been made, not by his deliberation, but by the silent bond that had formed in these weeks of shared survival. This unlikely family, thrown together by circumstance and sealed by compassion, had become something neither wild nor tame, but entirely their own. With trembling fingers, Daniel closed the door against the beckoning wilderness and set down the box, releasing its small occupants back into the cabin that had somehow, imperceptibly, become home to them all. Embers glow like fallen stars in the hearth, casting their gentle radiance across the cabin's wooden floor as twilight deepens into night. The light dances across the scene with tender reverence, illuminating what has become the heart of this once barren dwelling. There, nestled in the faded blue pet bed, now permanently positioned in the warmest spot near the fire, the mother cat sleeps in perfect contentment, her body curved protectively around her kittens, who have grown remarkably in the passing weeks. Their tiny chests rise and fall in perfect synchrony, their once fragile bodies now plump and vibrant with life's promise. The smaller one's paw twitches in dream pursuit of some imaginary prey, while its sibling nestles closer to their mother's warmth. But it is the sound that fills the spaces between the crackling fire and settling logs, that has transformed this cabin most profoundly. A steady, rhythmic purring emanates from the sleeping family, creating an acoustic tapestry that somehow makes the rough-hewn walls feel less stark, the shadows less empty, the silence less absolute. At the simple wooden desk beneath the window, Daniel sits with a pencil poised above paper, his weathered face softened in the lamplight. His journal lies open before him, pages now filled with careful observations of his unexpected companions. Their first steps, their distinctive personalities emerging, the way the bolder kitten always claims the highest perch, while the thoughtful one observes from safer vantage points. Yet what began as mere documentation has evolved into something more profound. Reflections on connection, on the unexpected paths life carves through the wilderness of solitude, on how 3 small lives salvaged from winter's grasp somehow rescued him from a different, deeper cold. His pencil moves across the page, capturing words he never expected to write. Today I understood that some storms come not to destroy, but to clear away what no longer serves us. In saving them, I found parts of myself long buried beneath grief and isolation. Their language of purrs and quiet trust has spoken louder than any human words could about what it means to truly come home. Outside, beyond the frost-etched windows, the mountain stands sentinel under a canopy of brilliant stars. The brutal storm has swept away into memory, leaving behind a landscape transformed by its passing, pristine, challenging, beautiful in its wild perfection. But inside, within these humble walls that once echoed with emptiness, a different transformation has taken place. One measured not in snowdrifts or fallen branches, but in the steady heartbeats of 4 lives now inexplicably intertwined, each saving the other in ways none could have foreseen when that first desperate cry pierced the winter night.